few minutes to talk about SD cards in general. As you can see, I've got an assortment of micro and full-size SD cards. And we're going to go through some of the stuff that's listed on these. And the reason I want to take time to do this is I was talking with a friend of mine who I generally consider to be relatively technically capable. And some of the questions he had regarding even some of the more common marks just between SDXC and SDHC were completely misfounded. So we're going to go through all the marks we have on these cards and a couple of other things that are related to them. And so what I want to go ahead and start with is just straight up the original SD standard. Not a new standard. The SD standard's old enough that the logo is actually based on an optical disc that Toshiba had wanted to use. And SD itself is a superset and an evolution of the earlier MMC card standard that was fairly popular early on. And SD originally only defined cards up to 2 gigs. So if you look, the only cards I have here that are just marked as standard SD and micro SD are this Lexar and SanDisk that otherwise actually have no additional logos. They have no speed classes or anything. And these are both sub 2 gig. This is a 256. This is a 1 gig card. The second we go larger than that, things change. Now, SD was the earliest variant of the standard, and for a while was quite common. I remember having MP3 players and cameras that couldn't use the larger cards when they became available because the controllers, or I should say the readers that were in them, were only designed to handle the original SD, only knew what to do with the file systems that were typically on these, which was FAT12 and FAT16. You don't need to go to FAT32 if you're not dealing with more than 4 gigs. And you'll note, like I said, there's no additional logos on these cards. These predate a lot of the more modern speed classes that you'll see on some of the newer cards I have here. So SD up to 2 gigs. Technically, all modern cards are not SD. They're either going to be SDHC, which is cards between 2 and 32 gigs. And that's going to be these 3 full-size, I should say these 4 full-size cards. And then those 2 micros that are up to 32 gigs. Everything beyond that that you purchase today is actually going to be SDXC. Nothing about this defines performance. Nothing about this defines anything beyond capacity. I'm actually just going to separate these out into 3 groups here on the mat so we can see all of our examples. And you'll note I have more micro SDs than anything else because although the SD format still exists, the dominant usage of these cards is devices that calls for micro cards. That's action cameras, smartphones, little security cameras, handheld cams. Typically are micro, although some of the larger devices still use full-size SD cards. Even my 4K camera that's up here being used to record this takes a micro SD. In fact, I normally use this Lexar micro SD. I've got a different card in there for the sake of having that out as an example today, however. So, SD, SDHC, SDXC are literally just sizes. There is an SDUC that is defined. I don't expect to see that for the next 5 years at least. The largest cards I've seen on the market are only 512 gigs. So SDUC, which defines 2 terabytes and above, isn't something I expect to see on the market anytime soon. However, it is defined, and because it is defined, the odds are if you get a high quality reader today, it will be capable of dealing with those in the future. I'm not going to promise that, but that is the odds. So these are just straight up capacity classes. There's no performance that's defined by these. In fact, if you look at this SanDisk next to this one, although this one has a speed class marked on it, I would expect both of these cards to perform fairly similarly, and we're going to cover that right now, actually. So the SD Card Association has gone through a couple of different ways of grading card performance, some of which are more well-defined than others. The most common one you see today is the UHS standard and the, let's see, I think I've got a sheet for this. Application. So we'll go with this. The most common ones you see today are the UHS Speed Class and the Speed Class. And what those define is a minimum write speed in a fragmented state for a card of sequential data. And that's fairly important for video recording. In some newer cards, you'll see these video speed classes used as well. And the SD Association has a lovely chart that is supposed to guide you. These aren't perfect because not all cameras are the same, towards picking the right speed class associated with your intended recording format. So SD data, standard definition, not particularly large, not particularly high demands on the bit rate. They say 24610. So theoretically, this Class 2 micro SD and this Class 4 SD, if I was to put those in a device recording standard definition video, should work. And then we have speed classes above that. Well, the 10 is the highest defined there. And we have recording formats like 4K that really call for more bandwidth. And you'll typically see cards, if they're rated for 4K, at least carry a UHS speed class of 3. That's an ultra high speed speed class, and 4K, depending on your camera, can produce a lot more data. And because of that, they also have video speed classes that are defined as well. V90 is the highest I've seen on any card. This card here, my Lexar card, actually should have had a V90 mark on it, and a new model of this card purchased today would bear a V90 mark, as does this Freetail card has a V60 mark. Theoretically, V60, V90, both applicable for up to 8K video, although I've yet to see an 8K camera that takes micro SD cards. Not to say that there won't be any. I have not had a chance to use one to date. Anyway, so we have 3 different ways of marking speed classes on cards that are commonly accepted today. These are speed class, UHS speed class, and a video class, and it is not uncommon to see cards with all of these listed on the same card. In fact, we'll use this because this is relatively large. You can see that this is a U1, UHS-I, and a Class 10 card. Well, Speed Class 10 and UHS-I define the same exact thing. In fact, there's no reason that that card couldn't have also had a V10 mark, other than this card predates those video speed classes. These unfortunately aren't the only marks we see on cards. they were, that'd be relatively simple. You'll notice both my Lexar cards here have 1000X and 1800X marked on them. These marks aren't as well regulated. There's no clear definition if these are read speeds or write speeds for the card. In my experience with these Lexar cards, they're actually read speeds. And those are related to, as strange as it may sound, CD-ROM drives. DVDs weren't as common when SD cards were becoming more popular. They used the CD speed of 1x to define how quickly cards could be read or written to. So that 1800x mark means that this card should read at 150 kilobits a second times 1800, which is actually rather absurd as a way of transferring that information to someone. You don't want to sit there and multiply 150 times 1800 and then down convert it to something that is meaningful. You'd much prefer to see something like V90 that tells me I can read or write to it at 90 megabytes a second. So we've talked about speed class, which defines the fragmented write speed of a card. We've talked about UHS speed class, which is just straight up how many megabytes a second a card can be written to. We've talked about video speed class, which was created to help correlate the various cameras available to the card's performance levels. If you get a camera and it says use a V30 card, well, a V30, a V60, or a V90 card will all perform at or above what that camera requires for its minimum spec. And if you put a V10 in it, it'll probably still record, but the odds are you're going to get dropped frames, jittery motion, and broken audio because the card just can't write the amount of data that it's trying to be fed. I don't know if any of you have done this, but I have thrown cards in action cameras before and gotten just garbage out of them and thought it was a problem with the camera. Well, no, the problem was that, I threw in one of these SanDisk 4 gig cards because I was worried about damaging it in that particular scenario, and a Class 2 card just isn't enough for dumping 1080p video onto it. In fact, we can see on their chart, they actually say Class 4 is the bare minimum for 1080. I don't know how accurate that is. I wouldn't really try and record 1080 with anything less than a Class 10. But that's looking at this from 2020, not when this chart may have originally been assembled. Well, it's got video speed marks on it now, but I'm sure the chart has been expanded since its original assembly. So, theoretically, we'll grab this Lexar. If I look at this Lexar, and this is one of the things we look at in our reviews, and I see it's Class 10, it's a UHS Speed Class 3, it's marked at 1800X, I should be able to test and get results that correlate with all three of those within a few percent. That 1800X is the most ambiguous. There's no real way to test it. I don't have a CD speed read test that'll verify something like that. So these are the common marks you'll see on cards that translate to speed. The other side of the equation, and you'll typically see cards that are U3 and V30 and above start to use this, is that a card can be UHS-I or UHS-II if it's UHS at all. So let's see, I think I have a full-size UHS-II card. I have a full-size UHS-II adapter. So, if you look at the back of a UHS-II card, and you can see it on this full-size SD card and the micro SD, you'll see an additional set of pins. And those additional pins are used for additional transfer rates. We can actually see these defined in the UHS spec. So all cards have to be compatible with this 12.5 megasecond bus speed. That was the first defined speed, and that means that theoretically if I have the first SD card reader that was ever made and it has a firmware that is capable of dealing with the fact that this is a 64 gig card, if I plug it in, I should be able to read at that bus speed at minimum. We have high speed, which was introduced later on, and this is when they started putting these class numbers on cards that defines a 25 megabyte per second bus. That's not the read speed of the card. That is the bus's bandwidth to talk to the card. UHS-I was the next one that we saw added. Most of our phones, modern laptops, my 4K camera are all UHS-I class devices. And depending on if this is a SDR or a DDR transfer rate, we can talk to it at up to 104 megabytes a second. Theoretically, you could have a UHS Class 1 V90 card. I've never seen one, and I honestly don't expect to ever see one, because the next step after that is UHS-II, where depending on if we were talking at full duplex, which is where we're reading and writing to the card at the same time, or half duplex, which is just data being read or written, defines a 156 meg or 312 meg transfer rate. And this is any card that I'm recording video to, I get a UHS-II card. The reason for that, even if I'm working with a UHS-I class device, like my camera here, like my main still camera, my EM1, I want to be able to pull the data off as quickly as possible. So to me, the extra cost of the UHS-II bus is negated by the time that I didn't spend every time I shoot a video like this, and then instead of pulling it off the card in 20 or 30 minutes, I've pulled it off the card in 10 minutes, and I already have it in my audio or video editing software, depending on what I need to adjust. UHS-III is not something that I have seen before. It simply doubles the data rates of UHS-II while using the same pins. SD Express is once again something that's been defined. I've never seen one. These use PCI Express signaling over an SD card. You'll notice that once we got to UHS-I, II, and III, standard SD cards were no longer defined for the additional bus marks. The reason for that is, quite simply, I don't think anyone wants to use a 2 gig card that they can read 312 megs to a second. You'd be full in, what, like less than 10 seconds? So, these bus speeds only define the maximum transfer rates of the cards. They don't necessarily tell you what the card can do. But we do still check to make sure that the cards can talk at least at speeds that tell me that they're using the appropriate bus. It would do no good to take this Lexar and plug it in and only get speeds that would have been the UHS-I interface. Really what we test when we're looking at these is readers instead. So UHS-I and II were implemented similarly to the way we moved from USB-II to USB-III. A standard SD card has one set of pins that connects, and if I plug a UHS-II card into that standard reader, it's only going to connect the pins that it touches, and therefore I'm going to talk at a UHS-I bus interface speed. That's fantastic as far as backwards compatibility is concerned. That means, like I said, I can use UHS-II cards in my cameras that are only UHS-I devices so that I can pull the data off with my UHS-II reader much faster. And just like USB-III, we added an extra set of pins. If I plug these into a compatible reader and the pins make contact, I'll be able to talk to the card faster. Now I can actually talk at 1800X or V90, as it may be, that this card is rated for. So, I know this is a lot of information to take in, but quite honestly, that's really all there is to it for most of us to worry about. There are a few additional things you may see on cards, and although I have seen these are less common. One new mark that we've actually reviewed a few cards with and that we're starting to see show up is these new application performance classes. And these do something that none of the previous marks have done. All the other marks were really different ways to define how quickly you could write sequential information. But these new marks actually define how quickly you can read and write random information. And this is important because one place that we're seeing cards used, I've actually only seen this mark on micro SD cards, is in phones and small computers. And when I mean small computers, I'm talking about things like Raspberry Pis, Odroids, and other little single board computers. And they're using micro SD cards as their primary storage. So the important thing here is that although most of our previous types of information were all sequential, taking a picture is a sequential operation, playing an MP3 is a sequential, recording video is typically a sequential operation. Applications, be it apps on your phone or full-blown software running under Raspbian, tend to be random. They tend to load the base application and then they want this piece of data for that level or this graphic, or they want this piece of information to know how they're supposed to treat this new equation that they've been told to load. So these specify minimum random performance, which a lot of older cards, like even my relatively high-end Lexar here, don't do great for random read and random write. It's just not something that was important when this card was made. These new cards, I've got the Canvas cards that were sent in, carry these application marks, and that's actually new to the Canvas lineup. I don't think the older Canvas cards had them. I will go back and double check to make sure that I'm correct there. So we're starting to see these application performance graphs show up, and obviously A2 is better. We're seeing A1 show up on a lot of cheaper cards. A2 is less common, but it is starting to show up more now. And the great thing is these have tests that the last card that I looked at that had an A1 test, I was able to go pull the SD spec test and run it and check. Because these minimums, if one section over 15 minutes is under that minimum, the card doesn't pass. This is actually one that I've not seen before, LVS. So these are low voltage specs. I'm sure that's more common in industrial applications where power is a concern. Most of our cards, in fact all of our cards here, are just regular voltage. I wasn't even able to find any LVS cards available on Amazon. The two other things you might see, and these aren't actually well-defined marks that are printed on the cards, I've seen what are called high endurance cards. These typically use more robust types of memory than what is commonly in cards today. Especially cheaper cards, odds are they'll be TLC memory, both for the purpose of, density. This is a 256 gig card, and cost. We don't want to buy SLC in everything. It's just too expensive. But I've seen high endurance cards that specifically claim to be MLC, and they define how many times the card can be written. These are more popular for industrial applications, and especially higher end things like higher end dash cameras for more sensitive than consumer use. So police and fire, you may see those used, although they tend to use things more robust than SD cards even. I've also seen high temperature cards or industrial cards, and these define wider operating temperature ranges. And although they tend to cost a little more, if you're planning to use something like a dash camera, I actually encourage you to look for either a high endurance or an industrial card that defines a higher operating temperature range, because at least here in the US, my car was 96 degrees inside the other day. And that was what the temperature of just the inside air was. That's not defining any of the metal or black surfaces. Something like an action camera could get quite hot and could cause problems with these cards. Heat will break down flash memory. I think that's all we have today. Thank you for anyone who took the time to watch this. There are a couple of other marks that may show up time to time, and if I get a card with one of those, I will call out what it is in the review. Lexar, I believe I've seen R's on the card for data recovery standards that aren't necessarily part of the SD spec. It may have also just been a data recovery service that they supported with the purchase of their cards as part of the warranty at one point. Beyond that, I hope I cleared something up for anybody who needed it, or that maybe some of you learned something, especially just random bits like that's actually a disc in the SD logo, or technically we don't make SD cards anymore. They're all SDHC or SDXC at this point. Beyond that, if there's any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will do my best to address them either in a reply or in a follow-up video if there was enough of them. Make sure to check out our Patreon. Paul set that up a while ago, and I have been failing to call out that we even have one of those. There will be a link to that in the description. And there will actually be a link to a few of these cards I've covered in reviews before, if you want to go back and look. There's additional information, some of those reviews regarding things like what file systems shipped on the card that was relevant at the time. I almost forgot, last but not least, I want to go ahead and thank Electrix for providing our opening theme and closing music. There's a link to his channel in the description as well. Go ahead and check it out.